Hey guys, this is Jason Haber for DailyClout, and today we're going to be talking about the South Bronx and the reinvestment that's taking place there right now, really the revitalization of the South Bronx. But before we get to the story of what's happening today, we're going to look back a little bit and sort of explain how we got there in a brief overview. First, behind me here, this is just a regular picture of an entry point onto the Cross Bronx Expressway. If you're local here in New York, you've probably driven on this 1,000 times and never thought much of it. So my goal for today is that by the end of this conversation, when you think of the Cross Bronx Expressway and you think of the South Bronx, that you have an entirely different reaction to that. So let's begin here. First of all, in terms of the geography we're talking about here, the South Bronx represents this portion of the Bronx, more or less. This red line here we'll be talking about later is the Cross Bronx Expressway, and to the south here is the areas of the South Bronx. The neighborhoods we'll be talking about include Mott Haven, they include Melrose. Sort of the South Bronx is an interesting history to it because for much of the 20th century, at least for the first half of the 20th century, it was a working class, middle class neighborhood. It was predominantly white. It was actually predominantly Jewish. There were at one point in time over 55% of the entire borough of the Bronx were Jewish. It was a real neighborhood in the traditional sense. People knew your neighbors. You got your groceries locally. You got your dry cleaning locally. You lived there. You had a life there. You died there too. It was a neighborhood that people stayed in generational after generation. And that changed over the course of the 20th century. We're just going to fast forward here for a few minutes and look at what became of the South Bronx. For those of you who came to New York in the 80s or 90s or later, this looks nothing like the city that you know today. These are all photos of the South Bronx. And you can see, first of all, this is the car in the water here, the sort of the broken down buildings in the background. This was all life in the South Bronx. Here's a photo of a mother and child posing in front of abandoned buildings. The South Bronx became a political talking point, as you can imagine, being with all the problems that they were having there. So this is a photo from 1977 of Jimmy Carter, and this was the mayor of New York City at the time, Abe Beame. And so President Carter came to see Charlotte Street. So Charlotte Street is a really interesting place in the South Bronx. So this was at the intersection of Charlotte Street and Boston Road, or just to the south of Boston Road. Now what's interesting is the area became so dilapidated that by 1974 the city removed Charlotte Street from the city's official map. So the street officially didn't even exist. To this day, no one can pinpoint exactly where this photo is taken because it's so barren. And not to miss a political opportunity, on the 1980 campaign trail, then candidate Ronald Reagan came to visit the same spots on Charlotte Street. You can see sort of the despair. And Charlotte Street in the South Bronx came to represent a broader narrative on urban decay. And sort of the second half of the 20th century is a conversation about what happened to this area and how it fell apart. The photos from that era are so surreal for us today. And in many ways, we take for granted the trauma of the latter half of the 20th century that this city went through. And we forget that there were tremendous problems here, that the city looked like at one point it was never going to recover. What we know of today, if you look at the last 20 years or so of New York, is an upward trajectory where you have lowering crime rates, rising population, and you have more people coming here. What you don't have are these sort of urban cores that are left in absolute ruins. You would not be surprised if I said this was a photo from, say, after a World War II battle, for example. This looks like parts of Germany towards the end of the war, or France during the war, when in fact this is right here in New York City. This photo was taken in the mid-1970s Most of these buildings burned down. Some was by arson caused by arsonists, and then others were just fires because of dilapidated infrastructure. So what's happening at this time is really interesting, and we're going to talk about the underpinnings behind what's happening here right now. You see, after World War II, the urban planners of New York, led by its master builder Robert Moses, set on a policy of building roads through cities. And we talked about this in my last DailyClout video with Naomi. But here in the South Bronx, more devastating than in almost any other place, because unlike the open vistas of, say, Long Island, where Robert Moses built before, he's now going to ram a highway right through an urban center. And this devastates the city in many ways. But before we get to that, the other element that's happening here is you have landlords that are not able to get mortgages on their buildings. They're not able to refinance their buildings. They're not able to get insurance on their buildings because of racist policies called redlining. So banks used to redline neighborhoods. They literally would draw a red line around certain neighborhoods and say, these neighborhoods we're not going to lend in. Why? Because they are predominantly, they had predominantly African Americans and Latinos living in them. Pure and simple institutional racism. And so if you're a landlord and you can't get refinancing on your building, you can't get insurance on your building, and you have a neighborhood where the population is declining, and when you have an erosion of your rent base and tax base, the buildings go to waste. What happens when the buildings go to waste? Well, fires start to happen. So the owners realized that they still had fire insurance, and so to burn down a building they could collect the insurance on since they couldn't insure it otherwise. And so you had case after case after case of buildings being burnt on purpose in the South Bronx. But on top of that, the city in the 1970s is facing bankruptcy. And so because the city's facing bankruptcy, you had a decline in services. So there were cuts to the fire department, cuts to the police department. These cuts were exacerbated in the South Bronx. So when there was a fire, when there was a police emergency, there was no one to respond to it. As a result, criminal enterprises would just take occupancy. They would squat in buildings and take control of whole swaths of streets and neighborhoods within the South Bronx. And the police were rendered unable to do much about it at this terrible, terrible time in the history of the city. Here's a photo of a fire being put out by the police department, and which again happened all the time. You can see here in this photo of what I'm talking about, the blunt force trauma that the Bronx was put through. Here's an on-ramp to the Cross Bronx Expressway, and you can see the densely packed neighborhood behind here, and you can see the approaching highway, just almost like a freight train running right through what was a neighborhood. The neighborhood most impacted in the South Bronx was a neighborhood called East Tremont. So Moses had built 627 miles of road, but perhaps the most devastating was what he did in the South Bronx in the East Tremont neighborhood. In that neighborhood, there was a plan to ram the highway through one section that would have destroyed 1,500 people's homes, 54 apartment buildings. There was an alternative that would have just eliminated 19 people's homes. But Robert Moses wouldn't hear anything of it. He had a vision for exactly where he wanted his highway to go through. He had the power to do it, unchecked power. Remember, Robert Moses, we discussed earlier, is an unelected official who draws his power from both city appointments and state appointments, and is very popular at the time. So popular, in fact, and so expert at wielding his power that city elected and state elected public officials were beholden to him. And not many people knew that at the time. The neighborhood fought back. They organized a civic organization. They appointed someone to start holding rallies, to have events, to work and discuss with their elected officials about this situation. This is in the 1950s, guys. In the 1950s, we're before the era of mass protests. We're before the Vietnam movement. So this was unheard of at the time. And again, this very easy solution here would have put the highway down through here instead of over through here. Very simple process to do. And so the neighborhood organizes like any other neighborhood would, how you would think to organize. They got their congressman, their state senator, their assembly member, the comptroller, and the Bronx Borough president all signed on and said, yes, we oppose the Cross Bronx Expressway. But perhaps even more powerful than that, the neighbors of East Tremont got the borough president of Manhattan, his name was Robert Wagner, to support them. The reason this is important is Robert Wagner is running for mayor. And he writes to them in a letter, I'm just going to read it to you as a quote. As you know, I have consistently taken the position that I would not vote for the acquisition of property for the Cross Bronx Expressway. I want to assure you that I will vote against any resolution before this board seeking to authorize acquisition of that property. And then he goes further. A few weeks later, in a community meeting, he says, I will vote against any resolution. The protests that followed were way ahead of their time. People took off from their days of work to come down to the old city Board of Estimate. So we used to have something called the Board of Estimate here in New York City, and the way that worked is the borough presidents got together with the mayor and they would vote for zoning changes, land use changes. Things today that have been broken up and done in different agencies were controlled by the Board of Estimate at that time. The Board of Estimate gathered on April 23rd, 1953, so there was a big circular table that they would sit in. And literally, as they're seated here, Robert Moses, who's pictured up here, comes in from behind them, whispers one by one by one by one into their ears. So how do you think Robert Moses influenced them? And the final question really is, how did Robert Wagner and the Board of Estimate vote that day? Well, as you can probably guess, despite all the public assurances that they would be against the Cross Bronx Expressway, they changed their mind. At the very last minute, they announced that there was no other plan, that they had federal money set aside, and this had to be approved. And Robert Moses got his way. And the destruction that followed, again, it really looks like something out of a war scene, really. Just complete devastation to the Bronx, gutting a neighborhood, and setting us on a path towards peril for the borough of the Bronx. You can see here in these photos. Moses was asked, was it difficult doing all this? And he said, oh, no, they just stirred up the animals there, so I just stood pat, it was easy. There was no real hardship at all, Moses said. He believed that breaking eggs for the greater good was okay. Greater good being the key term here. I raised my steam to the builder who can remove ghettos without moving people, as I hailed the chef who can make an omelet without breaking eggs, Moses was also fond of saying. And if that's how you plan for a city, then you take neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that we saw earlier, and you turn them into this. And that becomes your city. A city where the ability to pass through it in a car, not in mass transit, but in a car, is more important than the communities that have been there for generations. And that's what happened in the city. There's this famous clip during the 1977 World Series. The Yankees were in, and Howard Cosell is observing the fires that are burning just outside the stadium. There were several fires that night. The famous quote is, "Ladies and gentlemen, the Bronx is burning." It's interesting to note that Howard Cosell never said that. He expressed it, of course, but it's a quote attributed all the time to Howard Cosell, the sportscaster. He never said it. But it doesn't mean that it wasn't true at the time. The Bronx was in many ways aflame, both physically, but also politically and economically, because of all these fusion of problems came back to haunt them. The Bronx, though, has very interesting elements in its favor, always in its favor. First of all, it's the only borough connected to the mainland of the United States. All the other boroughs are not connected, so it has points of rail and roadways to its advantage. Secondly, it has a large waterfront. Here's an example of where the old containers used to come in and be ported here in the South Bronx. And it also has access to mass transportation. So when we look to build cities in the 21st century, the key seemed to be green, walkability, bikeability, mass transit, waterfront. Bronx has all of those things. And so since the late 1980s, very slowly at first, and now accelerating a lot over the last 5 years even, you're seeing a regeneration. So neighborhoods that look like this, abandoned old industrial, can be renewed. Here's a plan for the new waterfront in the South Bronx. Walking districts with bike lanes. Again, important. Access to mass transit. Very important. You can see here the South Bronx has the B, the D, the 4, the 2, the 5, the 6. Plenty of access to mass transit, which is very important here. This is another photo of President Carter on Charlotte Street. And again, we don't exactly know where it was. We know it was south of Boston Road. You can see how barren it is. Here it is today. Much different. Here's another shot. Same spot. Let me go back. 1977. Even the buildings that are standing are abandoned. There's nothing there. And today, leafy street with private homes, green grass, a community has come back to where before was just nothing. And then you also have the next wave of development coming there now, which raises new questions about gentrification and ensuring that the South Bronx will stay affordable, which is a fascinating concept to think about. We're concerned that the South Bronx could become unaffordable for folks. After the last 40 years, it had been mostly an empty wasteland. So you see how things can change in a city. When they name something as a new neighborhood, they give it a name like Soho, downtown. Now we're calling the South Bronx the Piano District. And you can see advertisements for new buildings. Here's one called a Reimagined Living Experience, New York's Piano District, the South Bronx. So it is indeed a lot of these changes are coming here today, and it makes us think about what cities need for the future and what they need to be successful. And what we're seeing is that the South Bronx has a lot of elements going forward now over the next 10 years. New stock of housing coming in there, good access to waterfront, good access to transportation. There are a lot of things to like about what's happening there. But in any city, in any time that there is this kind of investment, we always want to be considerate of sort of the larger plan here and how we're going to make sure that it's an inclusive economy, an inclusive neighborhood for everyone. And then lastly, I want to leave you back where we started with this picture. Back to the entry point in the Cross Bronx Expressway. And if you see this photo now and you get a different reaction to it than you did when we first started this video, then I guess we've learned some lessons today, and I hope you found this helpful and enlightening. And if you have questions about this online, I'd love to continue this conversation and hear what you think. So thanks again for watching, guys, today. Again, my name's Jason Haber, and look forward to talking with you again further soon.